Great. Next slide, please. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Ray Heimstra, and I'm the Associate Director of Orange County Coastkeeper. I'll start off by speaking about the multiple risks that this project faces and why these issues make this location the wrong place for this project. Coastkeeper is not opposed to housing or development in general. In fact, this is the first time in our 25-year history that we've opposed a development in its entirety. As you've heard me say before, this project is proposed to be built in a flood zone, subject to sea level rise on an earthquake fault next to a toxic waste dump. While good engineers can overcome problems, the combination of issues facing this project make the risks too high. There's still a lot of uncertainty regarding the risks at this site and the cost to mitigate them. The existing residential area was built before we knew the risks. We should not make that mistake again. Next slide, please. Let's start with what we know. The surrounding neighborhood are subject to flooding. Examples of that flooding during a normal storm are shown in the photos on this slide. The top photo with the dog on the surfboard is Magnolia Street right in front of the project site. The floodwater is over the curb and past the 6-foot sidewalk. The bottom photo is of the tank farm site, and you can see that it holds a lot of water. In fact, they had to quit storing vehicles on most of the site due to water depth. Building on this site will put that water into the adjacent neighborhood, raising the risk of structural damage. A 2018 study estimated it would take $76 million in improvements to the area to address existing flooding. Add on the tank farm project along with sea level rise, and the 2024 Q3 study commissioned by the developer estimates another $170 million will be needed for pump station upgrades. That adds up to $246 million. That's without the flood wall upgrades that also going to be needed to protect the project. The staff recommendation suggests adding an assessment district to the project to pay for their fair share of protection. If enacted, the city will likely include all homes in the area, not just the project homes. Assuming 3,000 homes are included, each home would need to pay a $330 assessment every month for 20 years to raise the needed funds. That's not going to happen. Next slide, please. The Ascon toxic waste dump is another unknown risk. The site is unremediated and will never be fully cleaned up, just capped. That leaves it vulnerable to both sea level rise and earthquake impacts. There's been no pumping study to show that the chemicals from Ascon will not seep into the groundwater, and no guarantee that current groundwater flows will remain the way they are, as pumping in the area will likely change. No sea level rise study will be done until the capping is done. There may also be risks from chemicals on the site we aren't even aware of yet. Not long ago, the PFAS family of chemicals were thought to be harmless. Now we know they're very dangerous. Neither the Ascon tank farm site or the have been tested for PFAS, and who knows what other unknown threats are there. The capping of the Ascon site has been a disaster, with the project on hold since 2019, and mobile air testing stations set up in local neighborhoods. The proposed conditions of deed warnings and methane protection of homes are just more evidence of the uncertainty and the risks. Next slide, please. There are many good reasons to oppose this project. The main thing is that we need to focus on not approving any construction until Ascon is fully done. And then we need to look at the site as a wetland, not just a detention basin. That was not looked at all. Thank you.
Okay, so the next speaker in the group.
I believe that's Charming Evelyn, who's also in as a Zoom panelist.
Might actually be me first, if that's okay.
Sure.
Go to the next slide.
Just don't want to use up your time in between.
Yeah. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. I'm Laura with Surfrider. There's just no way to justify this project from a scientific perspective. It gets sea level rise adaptation wrong, and it gets it wrong to such an extreme degree. It's completely shocking that we're talking about building here. We're talking about developing a site that actively floods today. We're talking about avoiding that flood risk by turning the project site into an island, which will actively flood the surrounding residential areas. And most significantly, we're talking about that displaced water potentially being full of toxic waste when it enters people's homes and garages. Next slide, please. This site floods today and it will flood tomorrow. Storms, of course, are increasing in intensity, and flooding in this kind of low-lying area is only going to get worse. The project is proposing to side-skirt hazards that everybody agrees exist in building on this area by turning itself into an island, in turn throwing the entire surrounding community that's sitting within the toxic triangle under the bus. This project will reduce the permeability of the area, displacing water, and will also add pressure to local drainage systems. It will contribute to flooding of surrounding sites which remain low-lying, and access and services to those sites will be at risk. The LCP requires new development to be accessible and serviceable with utilities, so this is contrary to the LCP. Next slide, please. I want to also point out that even given the acknowledged hazards, the staff report's sea level rise projections are underestimates. The modeling used does not account for the fact that under higher sea level rise scenarios, the ASCON and MTF sites will become islands, making floodwaters around them deeper. It also doesn't account for the potential for the nearby Talbot Channel mouth to be closed, which could affect stormwater damage and cause compounding flooding. Next slide, please. Of course, the word that should chill everybody's spines today is groundwater. The site lies over a tidally influenced aquifer within historic wetlands, and the staff report already estimates current groundwater depths to be either emergent or very shallow. This is illustrated in the staff report as groundwater depths that read as negative, meaning they are above sea level. More sea level rise will cause groundwater to increase in elevation, daylighting at the site, and inundation. Groundwater emergence could remobilize known toxins, some of which Ray talked about at the ASCON plant. And the applicant states that a clay or silt layer will be confining at ASCON, but this has not been truly assessed in light of sea level rise, and it's reasonable to assume toxins can transfer across aquifers. What's most frustrating about this project is that the coastal hazard risks to the entire area are already desperately obvious. This area of Huntington Beach will need expensive upgrades to the complicated system of channels and drainage infrastructure they already have to stay safe. And instead of focusing on those upgrades and taking advantage of a land opportunity to increase adaptive capacity, this project dramatically adds to the burden before the financing is really there. This is burden that, if great enough, will unleash toxins in residential communities. Therefore, we find this unacceptable. Charming's up. Thank you.
Looks like it's going to be Susan.
Susan,
Or
Charming, Evelyn, and then Susan Jordan.
Okey-doke. Ms. Evelyn?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, you're on.
Next slide, please. Good afternoon, Chair Hart and Commissioners. Charming Evelyn for Sierra Club. I chair the Water Committee and Vice Chair of the Environmental and Social Justice Committee. For the record, I want to say we all support affordable housing. Next slide, please. We all believe people should be able to live close to where they work, not have 2-hour commutes. Sierra Club and myself, we have supported Unite Here Local 11 at LA City Council, and we have supported and campaigned for Measure ULA and won as well. Being supportive of unions and affordable housing is not in doubt here today. When contacted by Unite Here Local 11 about this project, I said we cannot support you in this project as it would not be beneficial to the health of your workers, and I explained why. This development would be within the toxic triangle zone of an unremediated California Superfund site, the AES power plant, and the Orange County sewage recycling facility. Workers would be continuously bombarded with exposure to cancer-causing chemicals in the air, soil, and water. Sierra Club cannot support placing families in a cancer cluster that could affect future generations. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at some of the airborne contaminants from the toxic triangle. From ASCON, we have noxious sulfuric fumes and particulate matter that require 24/7 air monitors in schools, parks, and the neighborhoods. DTSC has put the off-site cancer risk at 99%. Special filters are required to combat air pollution in perpetuity, even after remediation. The community constantly complains of physical symptoms resulting from the remediation work and odors, so DTSC had to halt remediation work in 2019 after receiving violations from the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Power plants emit carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, methane, mercury, and other pollutants, again, cancer causing. Sewage treatment plants generate hydrogen sulfide, or ammonia, and volatile organic compounds. Compounds such as formaldehyde and toluene and tetrachloroethylene, all again are cancer causing, and these are also emitted. Next slide, please. Let's talk about soil and groundwater contaminants from the Aspen site. And let's remember that dust is the top layer of soil. DTSC failed the community of Exide, and we cannot afford for them to make the same mistake here. Contamination migration of Exide has spread between 1.7 to 5 miles from ground zero. And DTSC has not performed an off-site analysis as yet. They are waiting for remediation to be completed. We cannot let that happen with the Magnolia Tank Farm site. Signs are currently posted warning residents and visitors about dust and soil pollution. The soil contains arsenic, chromium, copper, lead, mercury, nickel, and all of these are actually in the staff report as well. Pit F contained non-oil field waste described as thick, sticky, black to brown, and odorous. This waste matter has impacted underlying native soils, including groundwater saturated soils underneath the fine-grained silty clay layer beneath the site. DTSC claims that the contaminated water cannot migrate because of the silty clay. However, it is obvious that the water has migrated because water will always find a path to move in any direction, especially if you add in outside factors as groundwater pumping, sea level rise, seawater intrusion, and earth movement. And all of these natural phenomena outside of earthquakes, and we are in an earthquake zone. We are also in a tsunami zone in that area. The groundwater, like the soil, contains cancer-causing compounds such as benzene and its derivatives, triethylene benzene, benzene, ethyl benzene, isopropyl benzene. Water and soil contaminants do not seek permission to travel, and all risks to human life and future health must be taken into consideration. Adding a 10 to 15-foot setback is totally ridiculous. Contaminated dust, particles have no boundaries. Next slide, please. Under the specific plan, the developer was not required to build any affordable housing. Yet, the specific plan requires 10% affordable housing or pay an in-lieu fee to meet the housing obligation. Kind of defeats the purpose, don't you think?
Charming, one sec. Do we have the next slide or is that?
Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
The specific plan does not include a provision for rental housing and specifies that all residential units on the site would be for sale only. Neither the specific plan or the city's development agreement stipulates affordable rental units be set aside for the hotel's unionized workforce. 6 projects offer open space and recreational benefits described, but only 4 are at the discretion of the city and not guaranteed to materialize. I then leave commissioners with a few questions. Why doesn't the developer offer low-income and affordable housing at one of his other projects, such as the proposed Bolsa Pacific at Westminster? Why is the city of Huntington Beach asking for a zoning change for this project, while at the same time proposing a charter amendment that would require a public vote on projects of these types that are environmentally sensitive or in environmentally sensitive areas? The City of Huntington Beach Charter Section 803 bans the city from implementing or enforcing any price controls on sales or rental of real property. What would enforcement look like? Who pays for this enforcement? Why should the commission approve this project when the city of Huntington Beach has opposed so many other truly affordable options? Example, Beach Boulevard Endinger Corridor Project. Is it because this is for people of color, low-income workers? Is it because historically it is acceptable to place people of color in harm's way? We really must take a closer look at this because this stinks of racism and segregation and redlining. And we cannot afford to say we support a project that puts people of color and low-income people in harm's way. Susan is next. Thank you.
Go ahead, Susan.
Can you hear me? I just want to make sure before I start talking.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm not used to testifying remotely. Commissioners, Susan Jordan, California Coastal Protection Network. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. To start, there's many reasons to reject this. To start, it's in an area and on a parcel that is already experiencing the impacts of sea level rise. Not in the future, but now. Most every time there is an intense rainfall or storms, it's impacted. And we know it's only going to get worse over time, but how quickly is unknown. What is known is that once built, there will be major costs borne to protect this development, but we don't exactly know who's going to bear those costs. Next slide. And if that's not argument enough, this housing is going to be built directly next to an unremediated California Superfund site. No matter how hard I try, it is this singular idea that I cannot get past, that anyone in this day and age would think it acceptable to deliberately build housing next to an unremediated toxic waste dump where the minimum setback from the nearest house is proposed to be just 15 feet, probably the distance between where you're sitting and the podium. And as you can see, the two parcels are separated by a chain link fence. I say no to anyone having an unremediated toxic site next to their backyard. That's the kind of bad decision-making that we have spent years trying to stop. We should not be allowing it to happen here. Next slide. Nor am I confident that the devastating contamination at the Ascon site is going to stay put on the Ascon site and not migrate to other locations, including the MTF site, regardless of what DTS says, especially since they did not conduct a sea level rise vulnerability assessment for the Ascon site or the MTF site before they signed off on an unrestricted residential development for the latter. And as for the housing, why is it only for 75 years? Where will it be placed? Clustered in one area, closest to the Superfund site? Next slide. We applaud staff's efforts to present you with suggested modifications that will translate the developer's much promoted benefits into legally enforceable requirements. But we don't believe these modifications go far enough. And while we oppose the approval of this LCP amendment, we felt it was critical to provide additional modifications for your consideration, and you should have each received a copy of them this morning. Next slide. At the top of the list has to be the requirement that no construction of the homes begin before the remedial work at the Ascon Superfund site is completed and verified. We believe there are enough questions about the viability of the clay silt layer that it's supposed to be a key impediment to the future spread of contaminants to justify that requirement. But it could also be a voluntary commitment made by the developer and the city in the best interest of future residents. Notification of the potential dangers is nice, but it's not enough. And given that DTSC plans to restart and complete the remedial work in the summer or fall of 2026, this timeline seems reasonable. Next slide. Require that the construction of the housing be delayed until DTSC has conducted sea level rise vulnerability assessments to better understand the impact that foreseeable climate change hazards will have or may have already had on the MTF and Ascon sites. Next slide. And when it comes to the affordable housing on site, which we applaud, if only this project was in a different location, we would like to see it deed restricted in perpetuity, not limited to 75 years, dispersed throughout the property, not clustered in one area, in close proximity to the Superfund site, with minimum setbacks of 100 feet or more, which I still feel is entirely unacceptable. The clarity on this is really important because, as the developer stated at the July 2023 hearing, he does not intend to hold on to the residential portion of this site. He stated that he did not consider himself a long-term owner of that portion of the project. That is why it's absolutely essential that these things pin down and that we're not exposing people to what we know is unremediated toxins. We're not living in that day and age anymore. This is the future we're talking about and people's health. Thank you.